The gift of tongues is the most debated gift in all of Christian history. And the reason is not complicated. Most believers were never shown what the text actually says. They were shown what a denomination decided the text means. Those are not the same thing. 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14 contain everything Paul ever taught about this gift. But almost no church teaches all 3 chapters together as a single argument. They take one verse from chapter 13, tongues will be stilled, and build an entire theological position on it without reading the verses immediately surrounding it, or the final instruction Paul gives in chapter 14. Do not forbid speaking in tongues. That is not a minor detail. That is the last word Paul wrote on the subject. And Acts 2:17 records Peter standing up on the day of Pentecost and quoting Joel's prophecy as currently being fulfilled. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. Not in the first century only, in the last days. No text Paul ever wrote closed that outpouring, and the last days, by every biblical measure, are still unfolding. 3 things will anchor what you're about to hear. First, what exactly does the complete text, 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14, read together as Paul's single argument, actually say about the gift of tongues? Second, what are the 5 specific truths that emerge from that complete reading? Truths that most teaching has either collapsed into a single category, stripped from their context, or simply never taught. And third, why does Truth 5 directly address whether this gift is still active today, using the text itself rather than a denominational position paper? 5 truths from the complete text. The gift of tongues, what Scripture actually says. By Truth 5, you will see why no cessationist argument can be built from the full reading of what Paul wrote. The debate over the gift of tongues has been running for centuries, and it has produced exactly the kind of trench warfare that usually results when theological disagreement calcifies into denominational identity. On one side, the cessationist position. The sign gifts, tongues, prophecy, healing, miracles were given specifically to authenticate the apostolic message in the first century, and ceased either with the death of the apostles or with the completion of the New Testament canon. The gift of tongues is historical, not present tense. On the other side, the continuationist position. The gifts of the Spirit are distributed according to the Spirit's sovereign will for the benefit of the body of Christ, and no New Testament text provides an explicit cessation date for any of them. They continue as the Spirit determines, including today. Both positions have been held by serious, biblically literate believers who have examined the same texts. This video is not going to resolve that debate by pretending it does not exist, or by declaring one tradition correct and the other ignorant. What this video is going to do is something more foundational. It is going to read what Paul actually wrote, not what one tradition extracted from Paul, not what another tradition emphasized in Paul. What Paul wrote, in the order he wrote it, across the 3 chapters that form his complete argument, and what that complete reading permits and does not permit a reader to conclude. Because here is the problem that both sides of this debate share. Most teaching on this gift, from cessationist pulpits and continuationist pulpits alike, does not teach 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14 as a single integrated argument. They are 3 chapters of one letter, written in sequence, building toward a specific conclusion, when they are separated, when chapter 13 is pulled out for a sermon on love, when chapter 14's regulations are taught without chapter 12's gift taxonomy, when the concluding instruction of chapter 14 is omitted from the chapter 13 conversation. The argument Paul was actually making becomes invisible, and Paul's argument, read in full, is considerably more specific than either tradition has typically acknowledged. Here is the distinction that will carry everything you are about to hear. Paul does not treat the gift of tongues as a single, undifferentiated phenomenon. He distinguishes, within his 3-chapter argument, at least 3 separate functions. And the confusion between those 3 functions is the source of most of the theological conflict that has surrounded this gift for 5 centuries. Once those 3 functions are clearly separated, as Paul separated them, the question of whether the gift is still active looks very different than it does when all 3 are collapsed into a single category that either all ceased or all continue. Let's go to the text. 5 truths. Each one is in the text. Each one emerges from reading Paul's complete argument rather than extracting individual verses from it. And each one will ask the same thing of you. Not what your tradition taught you, but what the text actually contains. Most debates about the gift of tongues treat it as a single thing, the miraculous ability to speak in an unlearned human or divine language. But Paul's 3 chapters describe at least 3 functionally distinct expressions, and conflating them produces exactly the kind of confusion that has characterized this debate. The first function is the public gift of tongues operating in a gathered assembly, which Paul addresses most extensively in chapter 14. This function requires interpretation to be edifying to others. The one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless someone interprets. 1 Corinthians 14:5. Without interpretation, public tongues edifies only the speaker. This is the function Paul is primarily regulating in chapter 14, and it is the function most cessationist arguments focus on when arguing the gift has ceased. The second function is categorically different, the private prayer function. For one who speaks in a tongue speaks not to men, but to God. For no one understands him, but he utters mysteries in the Spirit. 1 Corinthians 14:2. This is not public ministry. This is direct, Spirit-enabled communication between the believer and God that bypasses the ordinary mediating function of rational language. Paul does not apply the same regulations to this function that he applies to public tongues. The third function is referenced in 1 Corinthians 13:1, where Paul speaks of tongues of men and of angels, distinguishing between tongues that correspond to known human languages and tongues that operate in a register that is not human in origin. This distinction has been almost entirely ignored in the cessationist debate, which has focused primarily on whether the human language function of tongues ceased. Once these 3 functions are clearly separated, you can see why the debate has been so difficult to resolve. The people arguing against tongues and the people arguing for tongues are often not even discussing the same function. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. 1 Corinthians 13:8. This is the verse on which the entire cessationist argument about tongues is built. And it does contain the word cease, pasontai in the Greek, a future middle indicative meaning to stop, to come to rest, to cease of one's own accord. But here is what the cessationist reading of this verse consistently omits: the question of when. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. 1 Corinthians 1:13-12. The then in verse 12 is the time frame Paul attaches to the cessation he describes in verse 8. And what is then? Verse 10 tells us, when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. The Greek for perfect is teleion, completeness, maturity, the final consummation. The debate about what teleion refers to is a legitimate hermeneutical debate. Some interpret it as the completion of the New Testament canon. Others interpret it as the second coming of Christ and the full consummation of the kingdom. Others interpret it as the maturity of the church. But what the text does not permit any interpreter to claim, without importing an interpretation into the verse, rather than extracting one from it, is a specific cessation date tied to the end of the apostolic age. Paul did not write that. He described a cessation tied to teleion, whatever that refers to. And every cessationist who builds an argument from this verse must first win the interpretive argument about what teleion means, which the text itself does not settle. Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 13:8 do not legislate cessation of the gift in the first century. They describe a future cessation at a time Paul does not specify, tied to a completeness Paul does not define. The cessationist argument requires considerably more than this verse to hold. So, my brothers, earnestly desire to prophesy, and do not forbid speaking in tongues. 1 Corinthians 14:39. This is the final instruction Paul gives in the longest passage he ever wrote about the gift of tongues. And it is explicitly permissive. Do not forbid. The Greek is mikolwet, a present active imperative of prohibition. Paul is not saying, I am not forbidding tongues, but feel free to. He is issuing a command against the forbidding of tongues. The instruction is directive. This final command is frequently omitted from cessationist teaching on chapter 14 because it directly contradicts the argument that Paul was working toward eliminating or discouraging the gift. What Paul was doing in chapter 14 was not restricting the gift. He was regulating its public expression to ensure it served the gathered body rather than creating disorder. Regulation implies activity. You do not issue regulations about things that do not exist or that are in the process of being eliminated. Paul regulated the public expression of tongues because the gift was active, operative, and present in the church at Corinth, and because its public expression required order that the Corinthians had not maintained. The final verse of Paul's most detailed treatment of this gift is, do not forbid it. That is not the conclusion of a man who believed it was going away. Inayat wa saying. Kamo cheto. Three truths from the text, each one from what Paul actually wrote. But there are two more truths in this text, and they are the ones that matter most for those who carry this gift today. Return to the verse that most cessationist teaching passes over quickly. For one who speaks in a tongue speaks not to men but to God, for no one understands him, but he utters mysteries in the Spirit. 1 Corinthians 14:2. Paul is not describing a malfunction of the gift. He is describing one of its primary functions, a form of communication that is specifically directed toward God rather than toward other people, that bypasses the ordinary categories of human language, and that operates in the register of the Spirit rather than the register of rational understanding. This function is not the public gift of tongues that requires interpretation to be useful in a gathered assembly. It is something Paul treats as categorically different, a private, Spirit-enabled form of prayer and communion with God that is not subject to the same regulations as the public gift. And then Paul says something that should have ended the debate about whether he valued this function. I thank God that I speak in tongues more than all of you. 1 Corinthians 14:18. More than all of you. The apostle who wrote more of the New Testament than any other author, who was caught up to the third heaven and heard inexpressible things, who carried the theological argument of Romans and the lyrical heights of the Corinthian love passage. This person was, by his own account, practicing the private prayer function of tongues more intensively than the entire church at Corinth. He is not minimizing the private function. He is not treating it as a lesser gift, acceptable only until something better arrives. He is describing his own prayer life and locating this function at its center. Any reading of Paul that produces a conclusion he would have been embarrassed to apply to himself is not a reading of Paul. It is a reading of what someone else beside Paul must have meant. Okay, guys? For truth, the text has been clear on every one of them. And truth 5, this is the one that directly addresses whether this gift is still active in chosen ones today. And the answer is not in a denomination's position paper. It is in the text itself. Stay with me. And in the last days it shall be, God declares, that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Acts 2:17. Peter stands on the day of Pentecost, when the gift of tongues has just manifested in the assembled disciples, in a form visible and audible to crowds from across the known world. And he identifies what is happening as the fulfillment of Joel 2:28-29. But notice what Joel's prophecy says about the timing. In the last days. And notice how Peter frames it. Not, this was what Joel foretold would happen specifically on this day, and then conclude. But this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel, as a present fulfillment of a prophecy whose time frame is the last days. The last days, in New Testament theology, are the entire period between the first coming of Christ and his return. Not a narrow window in the first century. Peter himself, writing later, uses the same frame. Knowing this first of all, that scoffers will come in the last days. 2 Peter 3:3. Paul uses it the same way. In the last days there will come times of difficulty. 2 Timothy 3:1. James uses it of the economic exploitation of his own generation. In the last days, James 5:3. The last days are not over. They are still unfolding. And the outpouring that Peter identified as fulfilling Joel's prophecy was not described as a first-century only event that would conclude with the apostolic generation. It was described as the signature of the last days, a period that by every New Testament definition has not yet ended. Now, search the complete text of Paul's 3-chapter argument for any verse that explicitly closes the outpouring that Peter described as last days in scope. Search for any verse that says, the Spirit stopped pouring out the gifts described in Acts 2 at a specific point in church history. It is not there. Do not forbid speaking in tongues. 1 Corinthians 14:39. I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. Acts 2:17. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. Romans 8:26. These are 3 separate New Testament authors, Paul, Luke, recording Peter's words, Paul again, all describing the Spirit's interceding, communicating function as present, active, and available. None of them wrote a closing argument. None of them drew a line after which this function would cease. And the cessation verse in 1 Corinthians 13:8 ties the ending of the gift not to the apostolic age, but to teleion, a completeness that, by the witness of every other New Testament author, has not yet arrived. This is the complete text, not one verse, not one chapter, not one tradition's selective reading. The gift of tongues, including its private prayer function, including its public function properly ordered, including its expression in those who carry it today, has not been closed by anything Paul wrote. It was given as part of an outpouring that Peter described as last days in scope, and the last days are still unfolding. 5 truths. 1 complete argument, and a debate that looks considerably different when you read all 3 chapters instead of one verse extracted from the middle of them. Look at what the complete text actually says. Paul distinguishes 3 functions of the gift that most teaching has collapsed into one. Paul's only cessation language in 13:8 is tied to teleion, not to the apostolic age, not to the completion of the canon, and not to a date Paul ever specified. Paul's final instruction in his longest treatment of this gift is do not forbid speaking in tongues. Paul himself practiced the private prayer function more intensively than the entire church he was writing to. And Peter described the Pentecost outpouring, which included tongues, as fulfilling a prophecy whose time frame is the last days, a period that is not yet concluded. This is the text. Not a cessationist reading of the text. Not a charismatic reading of the text. The text, read in sequence, in context, as Paul's complete argument. And now, having examined what the text says, here is what it means for those who carry this gift today. If you have experienced something in prayer that exceeded what rational language could contain, a form of communication that arose from somewhere deeper than your conscious mind's vocabulary. You are not experiencing a psychological anomaly. You are experiencing what Paul described in 1 Corinthians 14:2, speaking not to men, but to God, uttering mysteries in the Spirit. If there have been moments in intercession where language broke down entirely, and what came out of you could not be constructed consciously, Paul has a name for that too. The Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. Romans 8:26. The Spirit praying through the vessel in a register that bypasses ordinary language is not a malfunction of prayer. It is the Spirit helping in the exact weakness Paul describes. We do not know what to pray for as we ought. If you have been told that what you experienced was not real, was not biblical, was not for today, the person who told you that did not give you 1 Corinthians 14:39. They did not give you Acts 2:17. They gave you 1 Corinthians 13:8 without its context, and built a position on a cessation Paul did not specify. Do not neglect the gift you have. 1 Timothy 4:14. The gift that has been active in your prayer life, the expression of the Spirit that has moved through you in ways your rational mind cannot fully account for, the form of communication that goes not to men but to God. Do not silence it because a denomination decided the text said something the text does not actually say. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. Romans 8:26. The helping is present tense. The groanings too deep for words are still happening. The outpouring Peter described is still unfolding. And the final instruction Paul gave to the church he wrote most about this gift to was not phase it out as you mature. It was, do not forbid it. You didn't find this video. This video found you. And if what you have been carrying in your prayer life, the expression that exceeded language, the communication that came from deeper than your own vocabulary, has felt uncertain, unsupported, or silenced by teaching that never showed you the complete text, today that silence ends. Read the full text, all 3 chapters, in the order Paul wrote them. And then do what Paul's final instruction says. If something was confirmed in you today, that is the Holy Spirit, bearing witness to what he placed. Don't silence that. Subscribe, because next week we are going into the gift that is almost never separated from tongues in Paul's teaching. The gift of interpretation of tongues, what it actually is, how it operates, and why Paul pairs it with prophecy rather than treating it as a secondary function. Comment below. Which of these 5 truths had you never heard in full? I read every comment.